The fog crept over the still waters of Fogveil Lake, its dense shroud casting an unnatural silence over the landscape. Cassandra stood at the lake's edge, her breath barely visible in the cold, damp air, as if the fog swallowed everything. She had heard the stories of the cursed mask, the one that no one who found had ever escaped. But tonight, something deeper than curiosity drove her to this forsaken place. Beside her stood Nolan, his usual light-hearted demeanour replaced by a quiet unease, and Mira, whose sharp eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of danger. Phoebe, ever the skeptic, lingered behind, her arms crossed as she muttered about how foolish this was. As the group edged closer to the water, the fog seemed to part for just a moment, revealing the faint outline of a boat half submerged in the murky lake. Cassandra's heart pounded in her chest. "That's it," she whispered, pointing toward the barely visible wreckage. It was said the last person who had worn the mask had disappeared into the lake, never to be seen again. Yet here they were, drawn to the same cursed object, as if something unseen was calling them deeper into the fog. Nolan took a step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, muddy shore. "I don't like this," he muttered, glancing at Cassandra, who was already determined to move closer. "We shouldn't be here." But Cassandra ignored the warning in his voice. Something about the fog, the stillness, the chill in the air, everything felt wrong, yet she couldn't turn back now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth behind the mask's dark legend. Mira crouched beside the boat's remains, her fingers tracing the old wood that had long since rotted in the lake's waters. "It's been here for decades," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind stirring the fog. "If the stories are true, this is where the mask was last seen." Phoebe rolled her eyes, but even she couldn't deny the strange energy that clung to the air around them. Every breath felt thick, weighted by something unseen, something watching. The fog began to swirl in unnatural patterns, forming vague shapes that danced along the water's surface. Cassandra could feel it now, the presence of the mask, its dark power lurking just beneath the lake. It wasn't just a legend, it was real, and it was waiting for them. The silence grew heavier, as if the fog itself was holding its breath, anticipating what was to come. Cassandra took a step closer to the water, her reflection barely visible in the thickening mist. But in the faint outline, she could almost make out the shape of something dark, something sinister. The group stood in uneasy silence as Cassandra reached toward the water, her fingers trembling. The lake was unnaturally still, reflecting nothing but the thick fog that hung over its surface. "This is it," she whispered, though it felt more like a confession than a discovery. Nolan and Mira exchanged nervous glances, while Phoebe remained stubbornly skeptical, though even she couldn't deny the oppressive weight in the air. It was as if the lake itself was waiting for something, or someone. The silence was broken by a sudden splash. Mira jerked back from the boat, her eyes wide. "Something's in the water," she hissed, pointing to the ripples that spread unnaturally fast across the surface. The fog swirled violently, as if disturbed by an unseen force. Cassandra's heart pounded in her chest. The stories of the mask spoke of an ancient evil tied to the lake, an evil that now seemed to be stirring. "We need to move," Nolan urged, his voice tight with fear. But Cassandra was transfixed, her gaze locked on the dark, murky water. The air grew colder, biting at their skin as they slowly backed away from the shore. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet something pulled Cassandra closer, as if the mask was calling her, urging her forward. "Cassandra, we have to go," Mira insisted, her voice shaking. But Cassandra barely heard her. She could see it now, just beneath the surface of the water, a shape, dark and looming. The mask. It was there, waiting, just as the stories had said. Phoebe took a step forward, her skepticism giving way to curiosity. "Is that the mask?" she whispered, her eyes widening as she caught a glimpse of the shadow beneath the water. It was darker than anything around it, as if the very light bent away from it. "We can't take it," Nolan warned, his voice rising in panic. But Cassandra stepped closer, her hand outstretched toward the water, as if in a trance. The fog thickened, swirling around her feet like tendrils, pulling her closer to the lake's edge. Just as her fingers grazed the surface, a figure burst from the water. It was not human, its form twisted and grotesque, its face hidden behind a mask, the very mask they had sought. The creature let out a guttural hiss as it lunged toward them, water splashing violently around it. Mira screamed, pulling Cassandra back just in time. "Run!" Nolan shouted, grabbing Phoebe's arm as the group sprinted away from the shore. But the creature did not follow. Instead, it stood, watching, the mask gleaming in the dim light, as if waiting for their return. Cassandra's heart raced as the group scrambled away from the shore, but the pull of the mask was still there, gnawing at her mind. She could feel it, even as they distanced themselves from the creature. The fog thickened, swirling in unnatural currents that seemed to mirror the chaos within her. "We need to get out of here," Nolan shouted, his voice breaking through the suffocating mist. But Cassandra stopped, turning to face the lake once more. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without the mask. The grotesque figure remained at the lake's edge, motionless now, as if waiting. Cassandra's eyes locked onto the mask, gleaming in the dim light as it reflected the fog around it. It was as if the mask was calling her, speaking to her in a voice only she could hear. "You can't be serious," Mira hissed, her hand gripping Cassandra's arm. But Cassandra shrugged her off, stepping forward with a sense of purpose she didn't fully understand. The mask wanted her to come closer, and she couldn't resist its pull any longer. As Cassandra approached, the creature raised its head slowly, revealing the full mask in all its dark glory. The intricate designs etched into the surface seemed to shift and twist as if alive, and the hollow eyes of the mask stared back at her, empty yet filled with malevolent intent. "Cassandra, stop!" Nolan cried, but his voice was distant now, lost in the swirling fog. She was too close, closer than anyone should ever be to such a cursed object. The mask, once worn by ancient figures of power, held an unspoken promise of unimaginable strength. Cassandra knew that if she reached out, she could take it, control it, become something more than human. But the voice in her head grew louder, darker. The mask wasn't offering her power. It was demanding her soul. Cassandra hesitated, her hand hovering just above the mask's surface. The creature beneath it seemed to shift, its form pulsing with dark energy, waiting for her decision. In that moment, the fog coiled around Cassandra's legs, pulling her toward the mask with a force she could no longer resist. "Cassandra!" Mira screamed, her voice filled with terror, but it was too late. Cassandra's fingers brushed the mask's surface, and in an instant, the world around her shifted. The fog thickened to an almost solid mass, and the lake itself seemed to tremble as the mask's power surged through her. The grotesque figure disappeared, but the mask remained, now fused to Cassandra's hand, and the fog, it would never lift. The fog pressed in on all sides, thicker and more oppressive than ever. Cassandra stumbled backward, her hand still fused to the mask, which pulsed with dark energy. She could feel it coursing through her veins, altering her, binding her to its power. Her breathing was ragged, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and strange new impulses that weren't her own. "What have I done?" she whispered, though the words barely escaped her lips. Nolan and Mira rushed to her side, their faces pale with terror. "We have to get out of here!" Nolan shouted, grabbing Cassandra's arm, trying to pull her away from the lake. But it was no use. The fog had them now. It was alive, moving like a living thing, tightening its grip around them. Cassandra could feel its weight pressing down on her chest, her heart pounding in time with the mask's dark pulse. Mira screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog, as if the air itself had turned against them. Phoebe, standing frozen in shock just a few feet away, finally snapped out of her paralysis. "Cassandra, we need to leave," she cried, but even as she spoke, it was clear they were trapped. The fog was no longer just a shroud. It had become a prison, and the lake's curse had fully awakened. The air felt heavy with the mask's presence, and as the fog thickened, it became almost impossible to see or breathe. Cassandra staggered, her vision blurring as she struggled to maintain control. The mask's voice was louder now, filling her head with whispered promises of power, urging her to surrender to its will. But through the haze, she saw Nolan and Mira still fighting to reach her, their faces full of desperation. For a brief moment, she thought she could resist, push back against the mask's control. But as her hand clenched around the mask, the fog swirled tighter, sealing their fates. The lake began to ripple again, its waters churning as if something was awakening beneath the surface. Cassandra's eyes widened as she realized the full extent of the mask's curse. It wasn't just her, it had claimed the lake, the fog, everything. And now, they were all part of it. The fog would never lift. It would remain forever shrouding the lake in its cursed embrace, trapping all who came near in its suffocating grasp. Cassandra fell to her knees, the mask glowing in her hand as the world around them darkened into oblivion. The fog was endless now, a wall of white that swallowed everything. Cassandra knelt at the lake's edge, her hand still bound to the mask. She could feel the power coursing through her, a dark force that whispered promises of control, but it came with a cost. The others watched in horror, unable to help as the mask claimed her. Nolan reached out, but the fog coiled around his arm like a serpent, pulling him back. "Cassandra, please, fight it," he cried, but his voice was distant, muffled by the suffocating mist. Mira's breath came in ragged gasps as she realized the truth. The fog would never lift. It was part of the curse, and now they were part of it too. "It's too late," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. The mask had claimed Cassandra, and now the lake would claim them all. The fog thickened further, its cold fingers brushing against their skin like the touch of death itself. Phoebe stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "This can't be happening," she muttered, her voice trembling. As the fog closed in, Cassandra's gaze met Nolan's one last time. She wanted to scream, to tell them to run, but it was futile. The fog wasn't just around them. It was in them, seeping into their minds, binding them to the mask's curse. The mask pulsed in her hand, a dark, twisted glow that seemed to consume the last flicker of hope. The whispers in her head grew louder, drowning out her own thoughts until she could no longer remember who she was. The mask had taken everything. The lake rippled once more, as if it too was alive, feeding off the darkness that had settled over Fogveil. The fog would never lift. It would remain a living prison, trapping anyone who dared come near. The mask was its key, and now Cassandra was its guardian, bound to the curse for all eternity. The fog thickened until it swallowed the lake entirely, leaving only silence in its wake. Years would pass, but the stories would remain. The legend of Fogveil, where the fog never lifted, and those who ventured too close were never seen again. The lake became a place of whispered fears, a cursed land where even the bravest feared to tread. And in the heart of the fog, Cassandra stood, forever watching, the mask glowing faintly in the endless mist. The fog would never lift, and the curse would never end.